Then Ms. Amanda Paul. Ms. Amanda Paul is a policy analyst and program executive and administrator of the EPC programs on EU's Eastern Neighborhood and Turkey and the Eurasia region at the European Policy Center. Ms. Paul is a specialist in geopolitical and foreign policy. She writes twice a week columns for the Turkish Daily on issues related to Turkey, Russian foreign policy, and the Eurasian region. She also has contributed to numerous other periodicals, including the Financial Times, the European Observer, the Kyiv Post, and the New European, and provides expert commentary on BBC, Al Jazeera, CNN, CNBC, and Deutsche Welle. And therefore, I welcome her to give us the European, a European perspective, or an European perspective. Please.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here today, and I'd like to thank the organisers for inviting me. I'm also happy to be representing the female sex in today's conference, because I believe I'm actually the only lady speaker. So, I'm going to try and give you a brief insight into Ukraine-EU relations. Ukraine is clearly the most important country in the EU's Eastern Partnership. It's the biggest, it's the most influential, it's a country that has the most potential. But unfortunately, Ukraine is also a country that is very vulnerable. It is a divided country, and it's exactly these divisions that make the country even more vulnerable. Many people say that Russia is the enemy of Ukraine, or Ukraine's biggest problem. I would actually say that Ukraine is actually the worst enemy of itself, and it's Ukraine itself that has contributed to the slow transformation of the country over the last 20 years. I think it's clear that what happens in Ukraine has a direct impact on the European Union. Crisis and instability in Ukraine affect this entire region. At the same time, historically, Ukraine and the EU have had what I like to call a dialogue of the death. On the one side, you have Ukraine saying that they chose Europe or the EU as its geostrategic choice, talking incessantly about getting a membership perspective and how they have a right to be part of the EU. And on the other side, you have the EU that's done pretty much everything it could do to avoid giving Ukraine a membership perspective. I think we all know today that EU-Ukraine relations are going through a very rough patch, which unfortunately risks deteriorating still further. For the most part, most of this trouble has been created by Ukraine itself. Ukraine has dug, or Ukraine's leadership, I should say, has dug itself into a very big hole, which seems to be getting bigger. Unfortunately, many in the EU have manipulated this situation and used it for their own interests. In fact, I would say that bashing Ukraine's leadership has actually become a popular pastime. Talking about sanctions and isolation gets you lines in newspapers. Some people who have never worked on Ukraine or who know nothing about Ukraine are these days contributing to this debate. Of course, nobody is denying that the backslide in democracy and other problems are extremely worrying. But I think it's fair to say that Ukraine is not a dictatorship. Ukraine is not Belarus. And I think the recent comments from Angela Merkel were extremely unfair. I think they also reflect perhaps Germany's agenda with other countries in this region. And of course, I'm not just picking out Angela Merkel, but there are other politicians or political parties who I could also say have also followed this line. The EU has been left very disappointed by Ukraine's apparent inability to listen to its concerns. Ukraine doesn't seem to understand that adherence to EU values, democracy and the rule of law are necessary in order to further deepen ties. But again, the European Union is giving the message now that it considers Ukraine's talk about the threat that's coming from Russia to be exaggerated, and it's not really interested in this. It's also getting tired of hearing Ukraine's argument that Ukraine is so geostrategically important, all of our arguments should be put to the side. This is also not the correct road for Ukraine to go down. The situation is particularly tragic because Ukraine has been a beacon of democracy in this region. It's been a significant factor in the deepening of the EU's policies towards the eastern neighbourhood, which have progressively increased over time. Of course, Ukraine still remains the leader of all the Eastern Partnership countries. It has implemented more legislation than any of the others, but if the continuing situation vis-à-vis democracy in Ukraine continues, this situation could soon change, and countries like Moldova or even Georgia could find themselves passing by Ukraine. It's obvious that the main reason for the deterioration, which has become increasingly politicised, is principally a consequence of the situation vis-à-vis Yulia Tymoshenko. We all know there's plenty of other cases out there, but the EU have chosen to focus, I would say, primarily on the case of Yulia Tymoshenko. This has now been linked to the signing of the association agreement and deep comprehensive free trade agreement that EU and Ukraine have been negotiating for the last 5 years. For this document to be signed, Ukraine needs to put an end to selective justice and improve rule of law and democracy. Ukraine has recently relaunched its reform process, which has been stalled for quite some time. And while this has been acknowledged in Brussels, most EU politicians are simply not interested. It's sort of been brushed under the carpet. Simple focus has just been continually placed on Yulia Tymoshenko, far more so than actually in Ukraine, where I think many Ukrainians are actually more interested in other more pressing economic and social issues. Just on the opposition, I don't always think the opposition are playing a constructive role. A number of unnecessary moves concerning blocking legislation which was fruitful towards these EU reforms has been blocked in the Rada for no particular reason, including vis-à-vis the visa liberalisation plan. I think Ukrainians are pretty much just tired of all politicians in Ukraine. What Ukraine really needs is a new generation of leaders, but so far there are very few signs of this actually happening. What we have is old leaders being regurgitated year after year. I also believe that the boycott of Euro 2012 by many people is particularly unwise. It's simply serving to undermine the positive image of the EU amongst ordinary Ukrainians. Many of these Ukrainians simply cannot understand why the EU is linking politics to sport and trying to ruin this special occasion for them. Okay. However, there are some sort of glimmers of hopes. Following recent developments, including the fact that Mrs. Tymoshenko is now under the supervision of a German doctor, and the recent promises made by Ukraine's Prime Minister, Mr. Azarov, to the President of the Parliament, Martin Schulz, has given some people in Brussels a glimmer of hope. Mr. Azarov committed to allowing Mr. Schulz to send an independent medical team and a legal expert who, according to the Prime Minister, will have access to the Tymoshenko dossier and be able to closely monitor progress. There are also rumours, and of course you have many rumours in Ukraine, but this particular rumour is focused on a new law that is apparently going to the Rada, which would allow Mrs. Tymoshenko to be treated outside the country. This would also be viewed in Brussels as a positive step. However, at the same time, next week there's going to be a new European Parliament resolution condemning Ukraine. Clearly, Ukraine needs to show that it's committed now to the things that it's promised to the President of the European Parliament and try to start moving forward in a coherent and a constructive way. Can Ukraine get back onto the right track? I think the most important things now is that Ukraine starts to take the appropriate steps to demonstrate a greater commitment to democracy, the rule of law, and to bring an end to politically motivated cases. It's clear that the 28th of October parliamentary elections are going to be a litmus test, and they have to meet international standards. This election is clearly going to be one of the most monitored probably in the history of Ukraine. If Ukraine fails to move into this direction, it's likely the association agreement will remain unsigned, and worse still, Ukraine may become further isolated. Such a strategy from the EU, if you can actually call it a strategy, is certainly not shared by all member states. I would probably say perhaps 3/4 of EU member states don't support this strategy. But as we all know, the EU is a club that works on unanimity, and this is life. So then you could say, what would happen to Ukraine's relations with the EU if you don't have the association agreement signed? Well, actually, beyond all the political difficulties at the moment, at a technical level, business is still going on quietly and productively, with the EU and Ukraine having a significant level of cooperation on many different sectors. This includes energy, transport, mobility, aviation, the fight against terrorism and organised crime, and regional issues. Ukraine is presently negotiating a visa-free regime with the EU. This is something that's very tangible and so far has been unaffected by the Tymoshenko issue, which I think is very important. And in terms of European security, Ukraine has been one of the most active non-EU countries in the EU CFDP. It aligns itself with approximately 90% of EU statements. Ukraine has been part of the Atalanta piracy operation in Somalia. It's contributed to the Libya crisis, and it also took part in the police mission in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And in July 2011, the Ukrainian naval forces joined the Greek-led European Union battle group, Hellbrock, on a 6-month standby duty. Ukraine is only the 3rd country after Turkey and Norway to be involved in such an operation. And last but not least, Ukraine is also an important and valuable regional actor. It plays an important role in the solution of the Transnistrian conflict and is due to take over the chairmanship of the OSCE in 2013. What they're going to do with this chairmanship, of course, still remains to be seen, and it will be interesting to see this. But still, the optimal outcome would be for Ukraine and the EU to sign this association agreement. I don't doubt that, and I personally strongly support it. It should be used as a tool to continue to engage with Ukraine. Ukraine made a lot of concessions whilst negotiating this agreement, which should not be overlooked, and it will represent something very tangible for society. Particularly the trade agreement can be implemented much more quickly once it's ratified in the European Parliament, because it doesn't need to have the ratification of all the member states before it kicks into life. This would have a big impact on the business community as it provides the EU and Ukraine with common rules and standards, which I think would be very positive once adopted. And of course, bringing these two agreements to life would immediately relieve some of the pressure from Russia vis-à-vis the customs union, Eurasian Union, and any other ideas the Russians may have cooked up by then. Leaving the agreement unsigned also risks the possibility of having to renegotiate it at some other point in the future, because if Ukraine was to come under a new leader, the new leader could decide he doesn't like this text, we want a new text, and again that could be another 4 or 5 years, which would bring us back to square zero. So just to conclude, I would like to state that I would agree with the recent statement by the Foreign Minister of Lithuania, Mr. Azubalis. He has said that isolating Ukraine is not the answer. Ukraine needs to be engaged, the opposition needs to be encouraged to cooperate, and a proper strategy needs to be formulated, because the Ukraine needs to give some sort of perspective to its citizens, and it's the job of the EU to help this along the way. Ukrainians deserve it. The alternative will only contribute to an increasingly unpredictable and unstable Ukraine, a Ukraine that will possibly be looking far more for closer ties with the Eurasia region, which is certainly not in the benefits of Europe. This would only serve to undermine stability and security in this entire region. Foreign Minister Abulets is certainly not the only leader to share this sentiment. Thank you.